All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton. Our next guest is Peter Hart. He's the activism director at FAIR, that's Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. Yeah, right, not North America, pal. He writes for FAIR's magazine Extra and is also co-host and producer of FAIR's syndicated radio show Counterspin. He's the author of The Oh Really Factor? Unspinning Fox News Channel's Bill O'Reilly from 2003. Welcome to the show, Peter. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing real good. By the way, I really like y'all's website and the things that you do. I'd be lying if I said I keep up with it all the time, but
well, don't lie.
You guys have many times I've used you guys as footnotes, proving my case about what the real truth was, beneath the narrative as push, and you seem to stay good on the most important issues, no matter who's in power and that kind of thing too. So I really like it.
Well, thank you.
All right. So this piece is called "Is There Really a Goldstone Retraction?" And I think probably a lot of people don't know anything about the Goldstone Report or that, whether it's retracted or not, or anything else. So why don't you give us a little bit of background here?
Well, this is an investigation it was a UN fact-finding mission headed by Richard Goldstone, who was a retired South African judge, and they concluded, based on their investigation, that there were an array of crimes, war crimes, potential war crimes, crimes against humanity in the Gaza assault in late 2008, 2009. It was very difficult for them to do their report because the Israelis would not speak to them and tried to bar them from getting into Gaza. They had to get in through Egypt. It's been hugely controversial since it was released because it amounts to a pretty compelling indictment of the way Israel conducted that war. And there's been enormous pressure on Goldstone since the report was released to recant somehow the findings of the report. So on Sunday in the Washington Post, he writes this op-ed that soon, I think it was released on the Internet on Friday, and soon was flashing around the Internet as, this is Goldstone's retraction. And that's how it was greeted in most of the press. The New York Times had a headline about Israel grappling with this retraction. USA Today, report reversal. Now, if you read the op-ed 3 or 4 times, like I did, trying to figure out what it is he retracted, it comes up considerably short. He doesn't have much in the way of detail, and the most you can say about it is that he's retracting the idea that there was a high-level policy among Israeli war planners and military officials to deliberately target civilians, the intentionality argument. And this leaves untouched all of the other conclusions in the report. It's 500-something pages about deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure, disproportionate warfare, all of these things that amount to potential crimes. What Goldstone is saying is that he doesn't think there was a policy in place to deliberately kill civilians, which is a very difficult thing to prove, and even some supporters of the report often said they would have a hard time making that case in a court of law. So we have this scenario now where Goldstone has issued this partial walkback of one part of the report. He's not empowered to do this, of course. It was a report investigation conducted by several people. He's one of them. His name happens to be closely associated with it because he led it. The other people who conducted the investigation do not share his walkback, whatever you make of it. But we are at a risk in kind of a propaganda system of seeing this now as the report that was debunked by its author.
Right. Well, and that's kind of the thing about it being called the Goldstone Report in the first place.
Yeah.
Here he retracts somewhat half of a assertion in a Washington Post column, and you're right. I mean, that's in the narrative now. It's been retracted, at least so far. It seems like the pro-Israel types are getting away with saying that. But now, on the question, at issue here, I mean, it sounds like what you're telling me is that because the Israelis would not cooperate with the investigation, Goldstone said, and the other investigators said, all right, well, we're looking at example X, Y, and Z of civilians being killed there, and we're thinking, without any information from the Israelis, there's hardly any other explanation but that they were deliberately targeting these people. Now more information has come out because of sort of the internal Israeli quote-unquote investigation that has made him say, oh, well, okay, apparently the policy was just so reckless that all these civilians got killed. It wasn't a deliberate thing. But now it seems like we're arguing semantics, or maybe even we're arguing about deliberate on the part of who, right? So like if a captain in the field says blow up that house, that's not deliberate as long as that's not what Ehud Olmert said to do or Ehud Barak said to do. Is that kind of thing, right? Or I'm confused, honestly.
I think that's correct. And again, you have this problem in that the Israelis did not participate in this investigation at all, did not speak to the investigators. The investigation was intended to pose questions about how Hamas conducted itself, how different Palestinian armed groups conducted themselves, and how Israel conducted themselves. Obviously, the death toll was wildly disproportionate. 1,300 people in Gaza die, I think 13 Israelis. So you are going to end up with an investigation that is more focused on Israeli actions because the war was so disproportionate. I think the Israelis would tell you that, and Israeli supporters would say, well, it's unfair because it's not balanced. Well, the war wasn't balanced either. The Goldstone Report does go out of its way to point out that Hamas, by firing rockets that it has no control over, essentially committed violations of the laws of war and should be those violations should be prosecuted. The Israeli violations were far more numerous and far more deadly. So there is increased pressure, I think, on trying to establish what happened there. The Israeli investigations that are going on right now that Goldstone uses as his rationale for his column are still rather murky themselves, and that's the head of B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group, wrote a follow-up column in the Washington Post saying, this is not really a retraction of the report. It's a modification of one area of the report, which is ironic because if you're reading the Washington Post, all you're getting is this impression that there is this retraction from either from Goldstone's column or from Richard Cohen, who wrote that Goldstone had retracted his findings, and he said that any deaths were inadvertent. Well, that's not what Goldstone's saying, and that's certainly not what Goldstone said in the original report. Inadvertent is one thing. Deciding that you were going to wage disproportionate war that claims civilian targets as legitimate is not an inadvertent choice. It would seem to be quite deliberate. The question is whether there was a deliberate attempt to shoot and kill civilians, and Goldstone's case now is that doesn't appear to be supported by the facts. Now, if the Israelis had spoken to UN investigators during the fact-finding mission, perhaps the report would be different. And that's really all he's saying, is that if the Israelis had presented the evidence that they seem to have now, I would have written a different report. How different is sort of up for debate, but we are, this column, which is murky and relies on some rather murky evidence, has now become a statement of reversal on the part of Goldstone. And what I fear is that, 6 months from now we'll be talking about the report on Israeli crimes that was retracted by its author, which is not exactly what happened at all, but could be the way it's interpreted in a media system that I think would love to see this disappear. And we should underline, so too would the United States government. The UN ambassador was, I think, speaking before Congress this week saying she wished that it would just disappear. They might get their wish if people decide that this thing now has no legitimacy at all, which would be, I think, a really tragic reversal of the truth.
Mm-hmm. Well, as ever, the New York Times, as Noam Chomsky says, sets the agenda for the rest of the papers, and if they have retraction right there in the headline, then that's pretty much the end of the argument. Still, somehow. I don't know how, but somehow. All right, well, I guess I wanted to, and you really go to great pains to explain here with a few good quotes from other journalists who noticed the spin immediately in the New York Times and the Washington Post and countered it. Jonathan Cook, for example, over at the Counterpunch. And such like that, and you and they seem to be making the point that there's a lot to this Goldstone report that hasn't been retracted one bit, and you've kind of been explaining about what supposedly the retraction amounts to, but I wonder if you can get into what still remains in there.
Yeah, you can read an edited version of the Goldstone Report. There's a book edited by Philip Weiss and Lizzie Ratner called Goldstone Report, and it sort of digests the findings so that you don't have to try to plow through them. But you are talking about violations of the laws of war, indiscriminate attacks on civilian infrastructure, attacks on schools, legislative buildings, attacks on police stations. We have police officers who were, I think, dozens of police officers in Gaza killed, based on the presumption, I suppose, that police officers might take up arms to try to defend the territory from Israeli invasion. So they were all killed somewhat early in the war, as a matter of fact. Attacks on mosques, on schools. Goldstone has one case, and this seems to be the only case that he names, where a family was killed, I think 20 members of a family in a single attack. And the reason he feels differently about this one was because he thinks now what happened was there was a drone image that was misread, and an order to fire was given, and they made a mistake, and therefore this family was all killed in one attack. So what he's saying is, there wasn't an attempt to deliberately go out and target these people for killing. They just happened to be killed based on a series of errors, according to the Israeli military investigation of itself. You can take that for what it's worth, but that seems to be the only bona fide case that he has right now. So you do have to read this as somebody who is troubled by the political ramifications of what he's done. And if you read the Israeli papers, Israeli politicians and political leaders have been very proud of the amount of pressure they've put on Goldstone, writing him letters saying, you'll have blood on your hands because this will embolden terrorists, and so on and so forth. I suspect that had a real impact on him.
Wait, I want to make sure I understand here, Peter. You were saying, were you saying that case of that family killed was really the one that they did it intentionally hinged on, and that now that he has this more information about how it was a mistaken drone strike, that's why he's had to retract it, because really this was the only thing that he was hanging his hat on, that they were hanging their hats on, to say that this was intentionally targeting civilians?
Well, there were a couple of incidents, and the way Goldstone says it is they had no other information to base their conclusions on because the Israelis weren't talking to them. So you had situations where civilians were waving white flags, and they were shot and killed. You had attacks on a mosque, things like this. That there was no Israeli. You have to look at it sort of as a court case, and the prosecution is making its case. Eyewitnesses are making their case, and the Israelis do not offer any defense of their actions. So the Goldstone Report looked at some of these incidents and said, this does appear to be a case of intentionality. Ken Roth, in his response in the Guardian from Human Rights Watch, was saying, Human Rights Watch had investigated these things. We're troubled. We think they're war crimes. We're not sure their intentionality because there aren't enough of them to build a case of intentionality. You have a solid case of using white phosphorus in populated areas. You have a solid case of indiscriminate attacks on civilian buildings, on civilian infrastructure. These are all violations of the laws of war. You can make your case that way, and that all stands, and Goldstone does not suggest that any of that has changed. So it's a minor, I think, issue here that they're talking about, an important one legally, but it leaves the rest of the findings of the Goldstone Report perfectly intact and well within our judgment to look at and say these things should be prosecuted. There's no sense that any of that has changed, but Goldstone now, apparently, based on what he's hearing from Israeli investigators, doesn't think that there's a case for intentionality. They should have this debate out in public and out in the open, and it doesn't seem to be happening yet. But the
well, and it sounds to me like, as far as the question of intentionality, you don't accidentally use white phosphorus on people. It seems to me like, this argument between Goldstone and whatever other factions is really beside the point to me. It's like a crime takes place and the cops and the prosecutors are, doing playing their role in it, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the truth of what really happened there. And, I just moved to Los Angeles in January 2009, and when I got where I was going, there on the TV was CNN International, because it was one of those times where CNN just has to admit that they're just not up to it at all. So they just flip the switch over and show the American people CNN International that we mostly don't get to see. And one of the first images I saw right there was white phosphorus bombs going off right over densely populated cities. A densely populated city, I don't know if it was Gaza City or where exactly, but certainly densely populated area, and there they are blowing up white phosphorus all over them. Saw with my own lying eyes.
Yeah, and I remember debates over white phosphorus and whether it was even being used in Gaza, and people denying that it was being used or saying that it was only being used in very limited quantities. And now I don't know that the Israelis have ever challenged the Goldstone findings on white phosphorus. And in fact, in some of these write-ups, it's treated as a fact, and you just move on. So it is the kind of context that you'd have to weigh when you're looking at, or when you're hearing about Israeli investigations, the Israeli military investigating itself, that there's a credibility problem here. The upshot of it is really that there doesn't seem to be much retracted here, if anything, but even from people like Ken Roth and some of the other human rights investigators, intentionality was always a difficult case to prove. They find the report overwhelmingly convincing on all of these other counts. We don't want to talk about that. We want to find this isolated strip of the accusations and suggest that Goldstone has walked back from that, and therefore the whole report is in question. That's what the elites in the media and in U.S. politics for sure want us to conclude about this, and the media is helping facilitate that conclusion.
All right, well, I want to give you a chance to talk more about what is in the rest of that report.
In the Goldstone Report?
Yeah. I mean, you're saying they're trying so hard to get us to focus on this narrow thing. I'm saying, well, what else is in there?
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating document in the sense that you are seeing and hearing eyewitness accounts of what happened in several attacks, and they tried to reconstruct the attacks as best they could in particular incidents. So you can read survivors' testimony. A lot of this was happening in public, where in Gaza, where the fact-finding mission would set up, and they would find surviving family members who talked about an entire building being blown up. These kind of door knock attacks where the Israeli military would drop a small bomb onto a building to scare what they thought were combatants who were inside into coming out. You have cases where people were trying to surrender, civilians waving white flags, and were shot. You have cases of Israeli soldiers using Palestinians as human shields, making them walk in front of them as they tried to maneuver through some of the alleyways. A really harrowing first-person testimony that is not contradicted, is not challenged. The Israeli government, the Israeli military is not challenging it even now. I think the way you make any case about war crimes is based on the survivors' testimony as much as you can gather it. And that's really what the Goldstone Report consists of, primarily.
Well, and the thing is, too, in the larger context, this wasn't really a war. It was like Nelson Rockefeller's attack on the Attica prison or something. It's hardly...
some of it literally.
It's like a man beating his wife, and you say that, they've decided it's a mutually amicable thing to split up.
Yeah, I mean, some of this was literally attacks on prisons. You had situations where, some prisons were actually blown up and the prisoners all escaped, those that were left, and the prison guards died.
Oh, music playing means we're all out of time. Sorry about that, but I've really enjoyed this interview. I really appreciate your website. It's fair.org, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. Peter Hart, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, and again, one more time, y'all. The article is called, "Is There Really a Goldstone Retraction?" Very useful.